Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the many news items we have for you this week are high-profile athletes, of a sort, choosing homeopathy over vaccines and still getting infected by the CCP virus. Interesting evidence on both the use of antiviral pills in the UK and how long antibodies within the body last if you are infected naturally. We then have a relatively clear-cut case study of whether or not there is any benefit to organic farming based on Sri Lanka. An interesting case of bioprospecting and a comparative product being derived from this that could equal or even rival ibueprofen. These and other news items for the week can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the very first item. NFL quarterback Aaron Rodgers chose homeopathy over vaccines. This, unfortunately, led to the somewhat inevitable case of testing positive for COVID-19. We've previously explained that it does not matter how much you dilute something, how similar the symptoms the thing you're using will generate to a particular disease, and more, that are the fundamental tenets behind homeopathy you try to argue. They simply don't work. Not just that, but the basis upon which homeopathy is built has no repeatable, effective, or scientifically backed mechanism by which it can achieve the results it claims to achieve. This is especially true if you choose homeopathic remedies over vaccines in order to get antibodies to a virus, in fact for any disease. When you look at someone like this who is relatively high profile, saying that they're choosing homeopathy over a vaccine, the simplest question is, how does taking a given sample of anything, diluting it down to practically nothing, if not nothing, and then say, oh, that will generate an immune response? The reality is just no. In order for an immune response to occur, the body needs something, and enough of that something to get the immune system involved and active. We've previously explained how antibodies are generated by the immune system picking up on antigens. These antigens aren't necessarily from a pathogen, taking these to B cells, which over time will refine themselves so that they become more specific to the given pathogen, or antigen more accurately, and then produce antibodies to it. This then allows the rest of the immune system to begin responding. If you don't have enough of a given thing, you simply can't generate that process, and if you can't do that, you don't get immunity. This is why, if you have a ridiculously dilute sample of a given pathogen, you're not going to get that. It's why vaccines need to have enough of a given antigen in order to stimulate the immune system. That is why you see some of the symptoms from a vaccine. The most obvious and immediate will be slight redness and swelling around the injection site. That's aggravation from injecting a small amount of liquid under the skin and penetrating the skin. Then that slight headache and feverishness, again, the immune system kicking in and doing its job. All of these things have to occur, and you won't get that with pseudoscience and woo known as homeopathy. While still on the topic of the CCP virus and immunity, antibodies are, as we've mentioned, one of the cornerstones to the immune system, and they're needed to get immunity. This is where a study that was published from the UK comes into play. The study looked at just how long antibodies will last in the body after you've been infected. This is another ongoing contention. Is natural immunity better than vaccine-mediated immunity? And as we've described in the past, the mechanism by which both work is exactly the same. The only difference is how controlled the symptoms from the pathogen, if there's one involved, and how wild and uncontrolled the immune response is, varies. In the case of a vaccine, it's far more controlled versus infection. The study from the UK is important for a few reasons. And it's not just that, yes, they can measure how much there's going to be as far as antibodies go. The important thing here is that they found the antibodies based on infection will last for up to 10 months after initial onset of symptoms. Now, that's a very broad term, and it needs to be clearly stated that this isn't necessarily after someone was treated or cured, just after symptoms first started. That means if it takes you a month to recover, it's really only going to be 9 months of antibodies that are protecting you. Further to that, what they tested was a relatively small cohort, 38 individuals, or at least the serum from 38 individuals. 10 months is still a relatively long time frame, and this is important. It's been argued at various times that antibodies from infection are relatively short-lived, often up to 3 months. This is nearly 3 times that long, so that's a good start. The next thing to note though is by comparison to a vaccine, vaccines appear to provide much longer coverage. So this isn't a better option, it's just that it does exist. Even looking at that, we need to note that when you take a vaccine, vaccines are often able to provide somewhat wider protection, and this study supports that. Further, the study also found that the alpha, gamma, and beta variants were still generating antibodies, or at least the antibodies could bind to them, just they had a lower affinity for them. So this means the original alpha variant was fine. Gamma and beta, less so. This was true even of the Delta variant, which is the newest and most concerning variant. The researchers do state that they believe that the vaccines will provide a wider and somewhat better protection, and better antibodies that cover more of these variants with greater affinity. Going now from antibodies to other treatments and ways to control the CCP virus. In this case, an antiviral pill. This is really good, as the UK has been the first country to approve it. Antivirals work a simple way. They reduce the ability of the virus to replicate, primarily its DNA, and this means that it can't spread as quickly. This gives all the mechanisms we mentioned with the immune system so far more time to act on it and control its spread, and hopefully remove it from the body entirely. This pill is important because not everybody can get vaccines. Notably, those who are immunosuppressed, immunocompromised, and have a variety of other comorbidities don't have the same strength of the immune system that others do. This is why it has only been authorized for people who have at least one risk factors that should seem fairly familiar at this stage. Things like obesity, old age, diabetes, heart disease, and the list goes on. If your thought from this is, great, we have a pill for it, vaccines are no longer required. No. This is not a replacement. In fact, very much the opposite. It's an additional set of tools available for those who need the extra support if they get infected. And that's where some of the most important caveats to this new product come out. It really needs to be given in the first 5 days of symptoms appearing. In those first 5 days, people may not even think themselves that sick, and this means the window of time by which somebody can get the benefits out of it that are needed is relatively small. This means the same continuing practices, social distancing, masks where possible, and vaccines are going to be the most effective measure at preventing the spread. This will just reduce the severity and duration of the infection. Going from viral infections that lead to disease directly to viral infections that gradually lead to disease. In this case, a study of cervical cancer and the relationship to the human papillomavirus vaccine. The human papillomavirus vaccine is something that in the last roughly 10 years we've been able to vaccinate, and it's a group of viruses. The HPV is something that can lead to cancer. The way it works, in women primarily, is that these cervical cells are infected somehow during sex. From this, the virus will enter into the cells and cause them to mutate over time. Most of the time, this will be picked up by the immune system, those cells will be destroyed. Occasionally, it will be missed, and a relatively benign mutation will occur, but the cells will turn into a tumor. If it's a malignant mutation, the cells turn into cancer. This is not a phenomenon limited to just women though. Males can have penis cancers, and both men and women can have throat cancers and a variety of other cancers caused by this. This is why the vaccine was so damn important. By introducing a vaccine that targeted primarily young teenagers and older teenagers who were, frankly put, at greatest risk of spreading the virus, they reduced the number of cases by almost 90% worldwide. 90% reduction. That is huge. And that's the gist of what this Lancet article says. The way this particular virus group is spread is either via more standard sex, non-standard sex, let's say, and various other acts. These can lead to the spread of it, and it doesn't take much, and that's why this was such a big problem. It was a sexually transmitted infection that was preventable with safe practices, and could, in theory, be cured if caught early and treated. The problem is, many people did not know they had it. That's where the prophylaxis of the HPV vaccine comes in. By doing it this way, we have almost completely eradicated the cancers it causes. It's the same way we've been able to eradicate things like polio by universal vaccination. Unlike, say, polio, this hasn't taken us 50 years, but a little over 10 years. Going from relatively modern evidence to something we've known for a long time, and yet we keep having to relearn the same lessons. That is, organic farming is not better. We can learn from a relatively cautionary tale or case study, if you want to call it that is Sri Lanka at the moment. In the last couple of years, they've gone from a mixed collection of conventional and organic farming practices to only organic farming. They've banned agricultural chemicals and can only farm organically, or at least that's what the president ordered. This is a problem. We've already produced a video where we explain in detail how organic farming does not work. The reason for this is very damn simple. Organic farming, if we're going to be generous, can produce somewhere between 2/3 and half of what conventional farming can produce. That is a significantly lower amount of food produced per square meter, acre, however you want to measure it as a relative unit. This phenomena has been well established, and the evidence for it has been clear across multiple countries on large-scale analyses. This is why Sri Lanka has just reinforced the lesson for everybody else. As they were changed from their conventional to organic farming, they saw a drop of between 19 and 25% in their crops on average. Some crops dropped by 50% or more, and there was some that could not be grown at all without the necessary chemicals to support it. There is also some contention that, well, if everybody's suddenly forced to farm organically, that it's not going to work. Unfortunately, that's not true in this case either. The same levels of productivity loss were seen in organic farming at the same time. So even if those who changed to organic farming and those who were already functioning the same way saw the same loss in functionality, it's clear that the commonality was organic farming, not the change. This has inevitably led to food shortages, price spikes in food, and they've now become a gross importer of food, which is a big thing. Going now from Sri Lanka's agricultural sector to an interesting article out of The Hustle, and primarily focusing on America's agricultural sector, but very specifically, and in a very timely manner, the economics of pumpkin patches around Halloween. This is a very interesting article and certainly well worth a read to compare the interesting economics from organic farming versus the relatively large-scale farming of pumpkins to make Halloween jack-o'-lanterns. This is something that you may really want to look into if you've chosen to carve your pumpkin this year. Americans spent roughly $10 billion on Halloween things in 2021. This is an increase over last year, and pumpkins are a very large part of that. The benefits of buying pumpkins will vary depending on how you get them. If you buy them from a pumpkin patch, you're going to see a variety of different pumpkin types, which is nice if you want to be more creative. This is driven not just by the fact that they want to provide more options, but that pumpkin growers choose to grow hybrids a lot of the time. These help with being disease resistant and also provide the necessary look. This of course does come with some caveats, let's say. This includes significant increases in price for those seeds. But then again, they also get significant improvements in yield. If you are a farmer, or however you wish to call yourself when growing pumpkins, you need to then consider what the value of this is. If you are going to sell pumpkins directly to the market from the farm gate or pumpkin patch, you need to look at how many you plant, how many you're able to harvest out of this, how much you're selling them for, and then all of your other overhead costs. Seeds, fertilizer, labor, marketing, insurance, fuel, vehicles, etc. And then how much money you're going to make per unit of land. This finally leads to the profit per that unit of land. Generally speaking, there's between $1,500 to $6,000 per acre according to this article. That's based on selling directly to the consumer. You have direct consumer versus wholesale. Wholesale means the farmer doesn't have to worry about trying to sort out all the money around it, getting customers in, and everything else. Rather, they sell by weight directly to someone else who buys a lot of pumpkins. For this, they get between 7 and 10 cents per pound according to this article. For those of you who aren't using freedom numbers, this is somewhere around $1 per kilogram and between 14 and 20 cents per kilogram respectively. The article provides a great deal more detail and, as we mentioned, well worth a read if you're interested in seeing a comparison between the cost to benefits of farming pumpkins and why some farmers will choose to go down this path over others. Going to other plant-related news, but in this case, an indigenous Samoan plant that was used traditionally for healing could, in theory, have equal efficacy to ibueprofen, a very common non-prescription painkiller that's used because of its anti-inflammatory properties. This is a very good case study of bioprospecting. The way it works is that, generally speaking, a scientist or pharmaceutical company will work with indigenous peoples. From this, they will then find possibly bioactive plants, in this case an ibuprofen type product. They will then try to isolate it, identify what it is, and possibly a way to make it synthetically, if possible, or a way to derive it from the plant, and then be able to make it that way. Preferably a more economical and efficient manner than mass harvesting of said plant. In this case, we've mentioned it is a traditionally used medication that was either ingested or applied topically. By blending it, pureeing it, and otherwise processing it into a liquid form, they could then test this in various cells. These included immune cells, yeast cells, and so on. What they found out was that it is a very effective anti-inflammatory drug. They describe it as being as potent as ibuprofen. Ibuprofen, of course, being one of the most common anti-inflammatory drugs. The researchers say that they don't believe it's going to be any kind of competition to that, primarily because, well, ibuprofen has the most dominant market share in that particular area. The other reason is that it's interesting not because of those properties, but by the mechanism of action that it reveals. Those mechanisms of action could be more important if they can find a way to turn this traditional medication into something that's either anti-cancer or effective for inflammatory diseases. Further to that, there's more than one particular variety of the plant that they've been exploring, and by looking at different forms of it, they could possibly find different kinds of potency and possibly other applications. Going from interesting plant-based news to somewhat interesting biology news. In this case, specifically the thing that you may not even be able to see here. This looks just like a bit of dust, but it's not. It is a microchromosome. These are tiny little chromosomes, primarily found in birds and reptiles. What is weird is that even humans have these microchromosomes incorporated into some of our own. What is even weirder is that there is commonality in an ancestor, but this common ancestor, where we still find the same things occurring, was 684 million years ago, and it was a small, fish-like animal. That makes this tiny little structure incredibly important in terms of the development of chromosomes and other ways of storing DNA. Currently, we can find these same structures in parts of much larger chromosomes in marsupials, mammals, and the previously mentioned birds and lizards. That means it could be an important step in the development of much larger and complicated chromosomes. This is just an interesting examination of one way evolutionary biology can be applied, and we can see it in action by examining multiple animal species. Going from relatively ancient news to very current, or at least 4 months in the making news. Astronauts on the ISS have finally been able to eat chili peppers. Well, more accurately, they've finally been able to eat chili peppers that they grew for themselves on the ISS. This might not seem like much to you. After all, many people are able to grow their own vegetables without any issue. The small space and the fact that it is in space means that astronauts on the ISS are doing this not because they just want to grow their own food, although that's a desirable byproduct. Rather, they wanted to establish whether or not you could grow your own food in space and then be able to apply this to long-term missions. Say, for example, a space station on the moon, or if you want to colonize Mars. The peppers were harvested this week, and the astronauts were then able to eat them along with tacos. While growing these in space may not seem like much, it's worth remembering that it is not a hospitable place. No one can hear you scream, but it's also very inhospitable for other reasons. Things like radiation, lack of gravity, and so on. Being able to grow any plant will be essential for those colonization efforts. It will be impossible, or arguably impractical, to ship enough supplies to somewhere like a colony on Mars or a space station on the moon on any reliable basis. This means that people going there will have to keep themselves supplied with water and food. In order for that to happen, we need to know now, will radiation prevent plants from growing? What about reduced gravity? And so on. It's not all good news though for these astronauts. In order to be able to eat their chili peppers, they had to complete surveys after eating them as well. Although considering that it's probably the only fresh food, and food that didn't come out of a bag that they've had in months, that's not exactly a huge cost. Our final piece of news for this week is more of an interesting read relating to the opinion of various NASA astronauts about the future role of private space stations. It is incredibly likely that in the near future, there will be private space stations, with companies already starting to deploy their own equipment in space with satellites, and a great many of them at that. Regular deployment of rockets into space. Tourists already traveling there. The next inevitable step will be their own space stations, whether these are to provide somewhere for people to stay in space. This could be something like a hotel, or simply a tourist destination, to stop halfway between their trip into space and coming back to Earth. These space stations will be important, and it's possible that NASA may choose to stop producing their own, like the ISS, and instead choose to outsource it to these private companies. If that happens, astronauts have expectations. The first of these is that it needs to be a cutting-edge laboratory, and that's very important when you consider things like we just mentioned with growing chili peppers. The ability to isolate them in an environment where they aren't going to be exposed to radiation, where you can try and minimize the effect of zero gravity, and other considerations for being in space. All of these are important. Then they looked at the more direct and practical benefits. Things like being able to see Earth. A nice large window means that they can clearly identify where they are and be able to see home, something that is very important when you're in the isolation of space. Finally, another thing they mention, and they do mention others so it's worth a read to see the full details, is some practical comforts. Primarily, the way the ISS is set up now, in order to be able to move throughout it, you need to move past crew quarters and things like a gym are mixed areas. This means that being able to cohabitate with other services and facilities truly separated away from the crew compartment for their comfort. There are, of course, as we mentioned, other considerations that they mention, and NASA's astronauts have perhaps a very unique insight into what they would need for this to be the ideal setup. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.